I hope you realize, I guess all of us have a habit of taking for granted what's around us. It's ironic as I travel, I'll say, you got this amazing thing. Oh, we've never been there. And I was the same way growing up. I think of things around Elizabethtown that others would come on vacation to see that we're 45 minutes away and we didn't. But God's fingerprints are in Colorado as much as anywhere I go. And I just love looking at the mountains. In East Tennessee, we have baby mountains. And in Alabama, we really don't even have babies, okay? We have a few little bumps every now and then. And I just am grateful to be here. And I'm grateful for the time that we might have together. A few years ago, I was traveling on a trip, to speak, and stopped along the way in Huntington, West Virginia. I don't know if you know or have heard of Marshall University, but there was a key moment on November the 14th, 1970. The Marshall Thundering Herd had just lost a really close game on a controversial grounding call, and so they had lost 17-14 to East Carolina Pirates and were on their way back. It was a stormy night. The airport was open. There was a Southern Airways flight coming in and an Eastern Airways flight coming in. Both had checked in with the tower. The Southern Airways flight had checked in, flying just a little over 1,200 feet, and so they were approaching the runway, and then suddenly there was an explosion as about a mile before the runway. In fact, as rescue crews approached the scene, they didn't know which flight had crashed. Whether it was the Southern flight that was carrying the team, or was it the other commuter flight that was coming in. And a local reporter found the wallet of one of the players on the Marshall Thundering Herd team, called back his office, and that's when the community realized their whole worlds had been turned upside down. With the loss of 8 coaches, 37 players, 25 supporters, among whom were many of the leading officials of their community, and then 5 flight crew members. And it literally turned that community upside down. As we think today, I want us to think about the book of Acts, but I want us to start in Luke 24. For many years, when I was at Freed-Hardeman, I taught Life of Christ and Acts were 2 of my classes I taught. I had certain text classes I taught, and then a number of ministry and theology classes. But I taught the life of Christ from the perspective of Luke, because a lot of students would take me for Acts, and I wanted them to get Luke's full story. And so Luke ends his gospel the same way he begins the book of Acts, the story of the establishing of the early church. And so he ends it in Luke 24 talking about the resurrection of Jesus and what happened after the resurrection. The text tells us there were 2 men that were traveling from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Now that's 7 miles from Jerusalem. There were a number of cities in Israel in the first century that went by that name. So it's hard to completely nail down where exactly this was. One leading theory is that it was a community about 7 miles west of the city. We know it was 7 miles away. The challenge is deciding exactly where that is, as you would have a number of cities dotting the landscape around Jerusalem. But they're headed out of Jerusalem headed towards the city of Emmaus. And the text says that as they were traveling, they were talking about the things that had happened that weekend. Now, this is the Sunday morning after Jesus has died on the cross. And whether you believed in Jesus or not, everybody in town would be talking about the public execution of the 3 men, one of whom was known as a rabbi and a miracle worker. Crucifixions weren't terribly uncommon. People would have seen them from time to time traveling the roads of Jerusalem. But the crucifixion of a rabbi and a miracle worker, that was not an everyday occurrence. So I want you to think about what's going through their minds. I want you to think about their feelings. I want you to think about their emotions. I'm a big believer in I need to become a part of the story before the story can become a part of me. So when I read a story in the Bible, I'm trying to figure out what I would be thinking, what I would be feeling, who I can identify with in the story. I'm often asking myself in the text questions. Why did he do that? Why did she say that? What feelings would have led to this or could have led to this? What are some options? And by immersing myself in the story, I'm then able to say, okay, well then how does that apply to me today? And so as I look at this passage and any passage, I want all of us to wrestle with the emotions they're feeling. And you're going to feel those emotions coming out as we walk through the discussion here in Luke chapter 24. So they're talking among themselves, and Jesus joined them. Now, it would not be uncommon if they're leaving Jerusalem after the big Passover feast. And Jerusalem at Passover, Jerusalem normally had about 50,000 people in population. It would triple in size during the Passover feast. So you're going to have lots of people traveling out of town on their way back home. And just for safety purposes, if for nothing else, it would be common for groups to group up as they travel. So it'd be very normal if you're walking with your friend and there's a guy walking by himself just to walk up and kind of join your group for no other reason than safety, but also maybe just for boredom. So you've got somebody to talk to instead of just walking down the road by yourself. So they wouldn't have thought much of a guy just kind of walking up and joining their party as they walk. And so what he does is he knows all things, but he wants to hear it from them. And I'm reminded, you ever thought about as a parent, you asked your child about something and you knew the answer before you asked it? You already knew what happened. You knew what they did, when they did it, why they did it, and how they did it. You had all the facts. You could have won the clue game, right? But you want them to tell you. Because how they tell you what happened often influences how you react to it. Jesus knew what happened. He knew what they were talking about, but he wanted to hear it from their lips. And I want you to notice that the text says when he asked them what they were talking about, the text says, and they stood still looking sad. Because that weekend, like that Saturday night in Huntington, that weekend in Jerusalem had turned their lives upside down. Their hopes, their dreams, what they believed in, or at least thought they believed in, all of that has been jolted. And their faith is being tested. Feel their sadness. Feel their hurt, their loss, and their bewilderment. Clopas says, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem and unaware of the things that happened here in these days? We talked about yesterday, we looked at the leadership of the Lord together, and I hope you realize what you have in your elders and deacons. I got a huge list of texts yesterday, and by that I'm not talking about texts on your phone, I'm talking about texts in the Bible, passages, scriptures, because one of the things we do is talk about what are some passages in the Bible about leadership, and I just loved what they unearthed. You've got a great deal of depth. You've got amazing leadership here, just one of the best elderships I've been around. And I was blessed by that. I want you to think about, I get a chance to visit with lots of leaders and lots of elders around the country and even around the world. So last year, I was able to be with a group in Long Island, New York, and their leadership, and not only that Long Island congregation, but congregations in that area, talking about the leadership of Jesus. And so after our sessions on that Saturday, one of the local men, they asked, is there anything you want to see in the New York area? And I'd been there, and I'd already jumped on the subway and seen a few things myself. But I said, I really want to go to Ground Zero. Okay, that's the one thing in New York I've never seen. The last time I was there, the towers were still standing. And so a brother, loaded me up and took me downtown, and he was working down there on September 11th. And so it was fascinating as we're looking at the memorial and we're walking around the area around it, him talking about the events of that day, Okay, so we're 24 years removed, but it was as fresh as if it were yesterday. I want you to think about, imagine that on September 12th, you run into someone walking out of downtown New York. You see someone walking out of Manhattan, and maybe they've still got a little of that yellow ash upon them. And they have no idea what happened in New York. What? Planes? Towers? Fires? People losing their lives? You'd have been flabbergasted to see somebody coming out of New York on September the 12th, 2001, who had no idea what happened at those two towers. The reason I bring that up is anybody that's in Jerusalem that weekend knows about the crucifixions. They know about the death of the miracle worker. You've not only got the crucifixions, but do you remember in the story? It was dark in the middle of the day. It's a weekend everybody's talking about. It's a weekend that no one forgets. So I just want you to kind of feel their shock at how in the world can you be walking? Because they're walking in the same direction. They just walked out of the same city. How is it that you don't know what happened? And so they began to talk about the events of the weekend, and they began to talk about what the leaders had done and talk about what happened to Jesus. And I want you to look at some of the language. Things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word. They believed in him. But he was betrayed by the men who should have supported him. And the text says they crucified him. And then we were hoping. Can you see that well enough on the screen? Verse 21. We were hoping. Have you ever really, really wanted something? I mean, just wanted something with all of your might. You've dreamed of something, you've worked towards something, you've sacrificed for something, and when you thought you were right there, something happened and it all fell through. Are you remembering a degree you almost got? A job you almost got? A relationship? We were hoping. He's saying we thought he was the one. And they were willing to sacrifice everything for him. But now they're not so sure. But they're also conflicted because they're not only saying we were hoping, but he said even now it's the third day and there are reports now that the tomb is empty. And so they're kind of wrestling with, okay, we were hoping, but then he died. You know, they would have assumed he was going to be a physical king and that the religious leaders would work with him and they would overthrow the Romans. Instead, the religious leaders turned against him and the Romans seemed to have overthrown him and they put him on a cross and he had a crown of thorns instead of a crown of gold. It's just not like they thought it would play out. We were hoping. But there have been reports today that the tomb is empty. And so they're just trying to wrap their minds around all that is happening. And as is often the case with Jesus and his disciples, we're looking at Luke. Mark probably brings this out as much as anybody. But in the Gospels, you have this idea that the disciples really struggled to get it. Okay, sometimes we think, oh, if I was there, I would have believed. And yes, it would have been wonderful to have seen some of the miracles and have heard the Sermon on the Mount. But the reality is, most of us in this room, if you grew up studying the Bible, you know more than most of those people who in the middle of it knew. You've got the whole story. You've got multiple perspectives on the life of Jesus. You've got the aftermath and the church and even things that Paul said to help some things make sense. They're trying to figure it out in the middle of it. What's going on around them, and they just really just struggled. And so you can sense at times Jesus' frustration with, don't you realize what's happening? Oh, foolish men, oh men of little faith. And then he began with Moses and the prophets and explained to them the things concerning himself in the Scriptures. Again, those of you who were there yesterday, I want you to think about all those passages we found yesterday. And I'm always enriched by that portion because there's always something I haven't thought about or a passage related to leadership that jumps out. I'm like, oh, that's amazing. I wouldn't have thought to go there. I would love to have the list of passages from this conversation. I would love to have been a fly on a rock and be able to take little, mini notes on a notebook. What did they talk about? What passages did he go through from Moses and the prophets? But he told them a story. Or to any of you, I'm going to see how cultured you are. Does anybody in the room remember the never-ending story? Okay, we've got some cultured people. This is impressive. How many of you are school teachers? Okay. So because I often find that it's the school teachers who've seen this before. I think I actually saw this in college. I was at a Christian college and they showed it there. But the never-ending story, it's about a young boy named Bastian who's being raised by a single-parent mom, and it's rough. Okay, he's dealing with not having a dad present in his life. He's dealing with bullying at the school. He's just really struggling at a crucial age as he's moving in that period in your teen years and junior high when you're struggling with your identity anyway, and you got all these other forces swirling around you. And so there's a day he goes into a used bookstore, and I'll be honest, he actually steals the book. Has an unusual emblem on the front of it, and it's the never-ending story. And so he starts reading about this land called Fantasia that's disappearing. The nothingness is eating up the land of Fantasia. And there's this warrior hero named Atreyu and his faithful stallion. And they're trying to save Fantasia from the nothingness. They're trying to save the princess. And as you walk through the story, he reads the story. He ends up in an attic at school. And in that attic, he's hiding in a storm, reading through the book. And what he discovers as he's reading through the book he stole is he starts seeing unusual references to this boy. And as he continues to read, he realizes he's reading about himself in the story. And that in the end, he, to save Fantasia, has to come up with a new name for the princess. He has to use his imagination. He has to participate in the story for Fantasia to be saved. Ironically, the point of the movie is that young people have stopped reading. Okay, this thing's back in the 80s, I think. All right? Isn't that interesting? They've stopped reading. They've stopped using their imaginations, and so the world of fantasy is dying. But here's the point I want you to take away. As he read the story, he realized he was a part of the story. That's what the two men on the road to Emmaus are realizing. Jesus goes back to Moses and the prophets, and he basically says, all of those passages you studied in synagogue school, they're talking about this weekend, this moment. You are now a part of this story. And what they had to decide is what role they're going to play in the story. If nothing else comes out of our study today of Luke's writings, I want us to realize that we're a part of that never-ending story. If you're in this room, you're a part of the story. And the part we play in that story is the most important decision that we'll make in our lives. So the text says they invited him to stay with them, which would be common hospitality. At this point, the text says they have been prevented from recognizing him. They sit down to a meal and they break bread. When in the story, if you've ever looked at the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and the events leading up to it, when was the last time in the story he broke bread? In the upper room. So now he's breaking bread again on the Sunday of his resurrection. And when he broke the bread, their eyes were opened. That's a powerful moment. Because normally what would happen is, you've heard the expression, the best thing since sliced bread. It really is a big deal that we had sliced bread. They didn't in the first century. Okay? It was a loaf. And so you had a big loaf, often it was round, and so whoever was the host or the special guest had the honor of breaking the bread. So you would tear it in half, and you would pass it around each side, and everybody would tear off a little bit, so you hoped everybody washed their hands, right? He broke the bread and prayed, and in that magical moment, that beautiful moment by the power of God, suddenly their eyes were opened. They realized who he was, and then he was gone. But look at what they said. Were not our hearts burning within us? They were prevented from knowing who he was, but as they walked with him, as they talked with him, as they communed with him around the table, just as the apostles had communed a few days before, there was this burning like, okay, this guy's special. There was just this feeling within them, even before they recognized him, that there was something different about him. And they immediately ran and reported that they had seen him. What I want us to think about in the 4 lessons we have together is hearts on fire. I want us to think about that burning within us and that burning within the people, and especially in the book of Acts. A fire. It was not just an ember, but it exploded into flame, and those flames of faith spread across the Roman Empire. The book of Acts is a bridge book. My favorite book is John, because it's written by one of Jesus' best friends. He's just telling about his best friend. But if I'm on a deserted island, and you tell me I only get one book of the Bible, I'm picking Luke, because all the rest are in it. Literally, the message of the rest of the Bible, the story of the Old Testament, Jesus, what he did for us, the establishment, all of it, it's in the book of Acts. It's a bridge book that connects Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John with the rest of the New Testament, and it tells a powerful story. For just a few minutes in the time we have left, I want us to think about the spark, that burning within that exploded into flame because some people would not give up. In the book of Acts, it talks about that which Jesus began to do and teach, the way Luke wrote it down. And Luke is the only New Testament writer that actually spoke Greek as his primary language. The others spoke Greek. It was a secondary language. So he's got the best Greek, among the best Greek in the New Testament. He actually has 3 different styles in his book. And so what's interesting, in a lot of languages, they will push words to the front of the phrase or the back of the phrase for emphasis. And we don't know if he did this here, but literally the way he wrote it is he's talking about what he wrote in the gospel, and then what he's writing in this book. He's talking about in the gospel about what began Jesus to do and teach. He front-loaded began. That may be insignificant, just a normal everyday way of writing. It also may be his way of emphasizing. In my first book, I wrote about what Jesus began to do. And this one I'm writing about what he continues to do. Because whether he intended that by that arrangement in that phrase, it is true. The book of Luke is about what Jesus began to do, but Jesus is still the main character in the book of Acts. He's moving all the chess pieces. He's interacting. He's the one who pours out the Spirit in Acts chapter 2. So he continues to be the main character. And so you've got this period, I call it apostolic graduate school. Okay? They've been with Jesus for 1.5 to 3 years. It's hard to know exactly how long the apostles have been with him. But they've been working with Jesus. He's been teaching them. And now he's got 40 days after the resurrection before he's going back into heaven. And he's going to go back 10 days before the day of Pentecost. And so he's doing final preparation. And in those final preparations, he's giving them order and guidance. You know, he's picked his spokesperson. So you can just think like companies, they have their spokespersons that advertise their product. If Jesus dies on a cross and nobody knows about it, no one is saved by it. And so he's preparing the men who are going to be his spokespersons. And he talked to them for 40 days, presented himself. He proved that he was alive, and he talked about the nature of the kingdom of heaven. Now, why did he need to convince them that he was alive, and why did he need to talk about the nature of the kingdom of heaven? Let me do the last one first. They thought that the Messiah was here to set up a physical kingdom. Even here in Acts 1, they said, is now when you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? He needed them to understand what he said to Pilate. My kingdom is not of this world. He needed them to understand that it was a spiritual kingdom that he was king of. But he needed to prove that he was alive because he was giving them a job. They were to be his witnesses. They were to be witnesses of his life, death, burial, and resurrection. You cannot be a witness of that which you are not convinced is true and you have not actually experienced. So he proved that he was alive by many convincing proofs because he needed them to go tell people that he was alive. And so you've got a series of witnesses that come to the stand in the book of Acts and talk about the impact that God, that specifically Jesus had on their lives. And leading that charge, you have the apostles. And he says in chapter 1, verse 8, which is the outline of the book and the theme verse of the book, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and the remotest parts of the earth. And that's what the book of Acts is about. It talks about the good news going to Jerusalem, then the good news going to Judea and Samaria, and then the good news going to the remotest parts of the earth. It's the outline for the book. It's also their job description. Here's what I need you to do, and here's where I need you to start. Here's the order in which I need you to go. Having given them those directions, then he lifts up into heaven. And what's interesting is Luke uses 4 different words that are related to looking, which is interesting. Again, he's got a command of the language, so he can use a lot of subtleties. But the one that stands out to me is a one that has its root, the idea of the stretching of the neck. And I'm always a little reluctant to overemphasize the background of a word because that doesn't mean the average person that used it thought, oh, you're stretching your neck, okay? It's just a word for look. But if it still carried that idea that came from its root, then the idea is you're stretching to look for something. You ever look for something and you're doing this? If that's what Luke meant by the word, why might he be doing that? I want you to imagine that suddenly Corey levitates. All right? So he lifts just a little, so then you're nervous, all right? But then there's 6 feet. You know, when he's 6 feet off that pew, you're not the only one noticing. All right? And then even those of you up here that can't hear him, by the time he's 10 feet up, there's a murmuring happening. Okay? And then nobody's listening to my lesson. All right? So as he goes up, let's imagine the roof opens up and he just keeps going. What are we all doing? We're stretching the neck. And so you have this beautiful picture of him lifting up. They see it, but they're gazing up into heaven as their Savior is lifted out of their sight. He's commanded them to stay in Jerusalem. And I want you to think about how hard that would be. Their master has just been crucified there. They are not popular with the religious leaders there. It would be real easy for the religious leaders to say, okay, we got the leader, let's just wipe out the rest. Who would be the next targets? The 11 of the 12 who didn't betray him. I visited, I said a few years ago, like on the, I want to say it was the 51st anniversary of the plane crash. I went to the Spring Hill Cemetery where several of those players were buried. And in fact, there were 6 of them they couldn't identify that are buried together. Nate Ruffin, who wasn't on the trip because he was injured, he was a star player. When he died, he asked to be buried there with his friends. And as I was walking through it, there was a guy going for a walk. That cemetery is actually a place where a lot of the local folks just go for their walks every day. And so we got to talking about it, and he talked about the impact all those years later that still has on the community, that they had recently had a memorial. And a family came in from California, the family of a ball player that died on that crash, and they had never been back. They'd never been since it happened. I mean, we're talking 50-plus years, and it still impacts that community. In the immediate aftermath, they wrestled with, what do we do? Some said, we can't play football anymore. It's trivial. It's unimportant. There are bigger. Our town has been gutted. You've got to remember, they didn't just lose a ball team. They lost a lot of their leading business people and officials because they were supporters of the team and were on that chartered flight. How can we worry about football? We dishonor the dead by playing a game. Others said that was their passion. It's what brought our community together. How can we not play the game anymore? We dishonor them by not playing. And they wrestle with, what do we do next? That's what's happening in the aftermath of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. What do we do next? Do we go back home? You know, John 21 shows 7 of them back in Galilee fishing. So we go back to what we were? Do we go forward? What do we do? And Jesus asked them to stay in Jerusalem, and they did. And it's fascinating that in the text of Acts chapter 1, he actually puts in the article. He doesn't just say, and they came together in an upper room. He actually says they came together in the upper room. And I don't know this for sure, but I found myself wondering, is that the same place where they gathered with Jesus for the Last Supper? And as you think about that, I want you to think about who's there. You've got the apostles. You've got the brothers of Jesus. You've got the women from Galilee. Can you see any potential for fighting and disagreement in this group? How do you think Mary feels about the whole lot? How do you think the apostles feel about the brothers and the brothers feel about the apostles? The apostles, were they there for Jesus when the chips were down? What did they do? They're supposed to be his best friends and his followers, his closest allies. What happened? They all left. One of them, Peter, denied even knowing him. The only one who seems to have hung around was John. 4 of the 5 at the cross were the women. The women stuck with him. The guys hit the road. How do you think his mother felt about that? We need to remember when he's hanging on that cross, he's not just Savior of the world. That's her baby boy. That's her firstborn. She woke up in the middle of the night when he had a fever. She fed him and comforted him and helped to heal a scraped knee. That's her boy hanging up there while the world laughs at him, spits on him, and he struggles for every breath. Don't you think her heart broke every time? It broke her heart. And here she is in a room with the guys that should have been there for him, his best friends. He died alone because his friends weren't there. And then there's her own sons. John 7:5 said his own brothers didn't believe in him. So Mary could have pointed a finger at all of them. The apostles could have said to the brothers, well, at least we believed in him. You're Johnny-come-lately. He's all resurrected, and now you're here. There was every reason for this thing to blow up and end right there. But the text says they were of one mind. They let go of the hurt. They let go of the pain. They let go of the betrayal. You know what hurts a lot of congregations? We haven't learned to let go. We hang on to every little thing somebody did, whether real or imagined. And we got folks we don't speak to. Our families haven't spoken for 30 years, and we can't even remember why we originally stopped speaking. I think we can learn something from them. The key to a one mind is letting go of the past and start living in the future. They had hurt, they had pain, they had betrayal, but they also had a job. And far too often we hang on to the pain because we're not focusing on the mission. God gave them a mission, God gave us a mission. What had to happen in Huntington is they made the decision to start over, and that starting over started with hiring a coach. The first few turned them down. They actually had a coach accepted the job. He lasted 1 week. And finally they got Coach Jack. It symbolized we're moving forward. One coach, one hire. Jumping back 2,000 years ago, the sign they were moving forward was the appointing of an apostle. If you've ever read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have you ever noticed how many times they're referred to as the 12? But they're not the 12 in this story. They're the 11 because Judas betrayed Jesus. So there's something symbolic. There's no evidence that they replaced every apostle when they stepped out, but this one was a big deal. This was a sign we are the 12 again, and we're moving forward. And so Peter led them in that charge and challenged them that there might be a replacement for Judas and talked about how it was the fulfillment of Scripture. Even gave the qualities or qualifications of an apostle, that you had to have been with Jesus from his baptism, where you have the sign and the statement that he is the Son of God, until his ascension back into heaven. And it's a reminder that in a lot of the stories in the Gospels that focus on the apostles, there were other disciples hanging around at the time. And so having given those qualities, I want you to notice what they did next. They put forward Joseph and Matthias, and then they talked to Jesus. Now, why did the apostles pray directly to Jesus? Who picks an apostle? Do you do a vote? Do you do a show of hands? Do you fill out an application, have an interview process? The apostles are handpicked by Jesus. Luke 6 says he prayed all night and then picked the 12. So if they're going to replace Judas, they don't do it by a vote, a show of hands. You have the one who's in charge of picking apostles make the choice. So they asked Jesus to show which one that he had chosen. Do you see what I've got underlined there? Can you read it well enough? You, Lord, know the hearts of all men. Lord, let me put it in my language. You know which heart's on fire. You know which one is best suited for this office. So they cast lots, but they did not believe that chance had anything to do with the casting of lots. They believed Jesus was using the lot to choose the right heart. And Matthias was chosen. I've often wondered how Joseph dealt with the rejection and what happened after this story. But he's added to the 11 apostles, and then the rest is history. In chapter 2, you have 12 tongues of fire that come down on their heads, the proclamation of the gospel, 3,000 are baptized, but those fires are not there if the spark in those 120 hearts and the spark in those 12 apostles goes out in chapter 1. The fire is there because the spark was still there. It only takes a spark to get a fire going. And they had a choice. Do we let it go out or do we fan it into flame? And they chose to fan it into flame, and the flames of faith spread across the Roman Empire. For the next decade, the Marshall Thundering Herd football team was literally the worst team in college football in the entire country. They lost game after game after game. For 20 years, they were largely a losing program, or at least for about 15. But then they began to win again. And what followed was conference championships and national championships and changed conferences, and they continued to have championships. For years, they were losers. But then they became winners. And year after year, you'll find if you follow them, they often play in bowl games. In fact, I think this last year they were 10-3 and played in a bowl game. Although I think they had to cancel the last minute because all the transfers, because of the new transfer rules. There are a number of Marshall football players who have and do play in the NFL. This lesson is not about them. They're just an illustration, but here's my point. None of that happens if they quit in 1970. And none of this in this room, none of that of what's happening at the Bear Valley Bible Institute, none of us are Christians if those people give up in Acts chapter 1. There's a lot out there in the world that is threatening faith. There's a movement against God and Christ and what we stand for. There are people broken and hurting, and often that heartbreak and that we were hoping feeling is driving people. It becomes a wedge between them and God. People need a hope. They need something to believe in. They need some fire inside because they've gone dark within because of the world around us. We're here because those people took a stand 2,000 years ago. If God keeps spinning this planet, will there still be a congregation at Bear Valley 2,000 years from now? We're here because they were there, and they will be here because of what we do now. My prayer is that today we light some spiritual fires. Our Father in heaven, thank you for your love and grace. Thank you for your Son. And please light fires within us. In His name we pray. Amen.